Counter-Strike 2 has an impossible balance to strike. On one hand, the game wants to be competitive, but on the other hand, this game also wants to look very pretty. Gameplay should always come first and foremost in a competitive game like CS2. Money is on the line, careers are built around this title, so it needs to feature competitively viable maps, which won't get in the way of the gameplay. But if that's all that mattered, then the maps in this game would all just be textureless rooms and corridors, maybe colour coded for easy callouts, with crates dotted about for cover, and the players would be glowing orbs that are impossible to confuse with the scenery around them. Some cheats come to mind which actually do this already, though in my opinion, if this aspect of the cheat gives cheaters a sizable advantage, then the failing is with the default textures and models used in the game. The relatively recently added boost contrast feature goes a long way towards fixing character model visibility on maps, and it does this by combining increased contrast on the player models, along with reduced contrast around them, and other minor tweaks all working together to help players to stand out better against the maps they inhabit. This, in conjunction with smarter map design, should do away with any significant issues with seeing enemies in Counter-Strike, and all achieved without requiring a glowing green character model. Brilliant. So on to the topic of smarter map designs. Early on with CSGO, maps had two different versions. There were prettier ones for casual play and simpler looking ones for competitive modes. Then Valve realised how hard it was to maintain two different versions of every map and decided just to combine the two. Because why should casual players not have readable maps, and why should competitive players not have pretty ones, and so on. Plus, boxy rooms with corridors with crates everywhere? We may as well have just stuck with 1.6, and we very well may have done, had Valve not tried so hard to fragment the player base, first by releasing Condition Zero, and then with Counter-Strike Source, based on their new graphics engine. Come to think of it, I was one of the people who got into Counter-Strike with Source, probably because of its cutting-edge graphics engine for the time. And looking back, mapping has very clearly greatly influenced Counter-Strike since the very beginning. I think a large part of why we moved to Counter-Strike 2 was to enable mappers to create better looking maps more easily. Because while graphics should always come second to gameplay, they do still have value. CS2 is a spectator sport after all, and as shallow as it may be, people probably won't find it quite as enjoyable to watch the game if every map was just the same series of blank corridors and boxy cover. And in a way, it wouldn't be great for the viewing experience either, if everywhere in the map looked virtually the same. At least with pretty graphics, every part of the map can look unique, and immediately recognisable at a mere glance. It might not matter quite so much for the players playing on the maps, but it certainly helps viewers to understand where stuff is happening. And I guess it leads to more original callouts as well. And yet everywhere will still be called Diggity or Gay Spot. And there's another kind of competition going on as well in Counter-Strike, and that's between the mappers. Back in the early days of CSGO, the first few operations featured all kinds of maps. There were some that certainly didn't get in for their graphics, but after that the number of maps in the workshop boomed. The standards for those maps rose, and just like a pretty girl on a dating site, judging based on looks quickly became a handy way to immediately discard most of these entries and to whittle the rest down to a more manageable number. Because if it takes pride in how it looks, then it's more likely to also take pride in how it plays. Those that are left can then be tested on to see if they're good enough to marry or to let everyone play on or whatever. I mean, the dating analogy breaks down here a bit. Or does it? So yeah, graphics are a great way of attracting players to your map, and to keep them around after the thrill of running down the same corridor for the 100th time eventually wears off. But the graphics should never come at the expense of the gameplay. When Source 1 came out with its Havoc physics, the gameplay of Half-Life 2 was heavily based around this new feature, and sure enough it also found its way into Counter-Strike Source, but I'm not sure its use in that game was so well thought out, nor quite so gameplay focused. I would argue its implementation in Counter-Strike Source was more of a graphical enhancement, with how it swapped out the stiff looking death animations for the much limper looking ragdolls, and how it made previously static stuff start flying about everywhere. Maybe in the name of realism, or maybe just because it looked kind of cool. But this was what separated Counter-Strike Source from the earlier Counter-Strike games. It now had barrels rolling about everywhere. You could block doorways with them. You could hide the bomb underneath them. This is probably what drew a lot of people to this version of the game in the first place. And it itself is a kind of gameplay. But is it a gameplay that's compatible with the rest of Counter-Strike? Or does it merely hinder the more skillful aspects of gameplay after a while? I mean, you tell me, I quite like rolling stuff about everywhere. But it was admittedly annoying to run into these things and to bounce off them inconsistently, or to slide through them, or even to get sucked inside them from time to time. Especially when you were trying to play the game properly. I would argue the Source 2 equivalent of Source's physics feature would be the new volumetric smokes, which do at least address a number of graphical and gameplay issues the older smoke effects suffered from. But let's be honest, they were also added because they looked kind of cool. But let's rewind to the physics again. It was decided that the physics of Counter-Strike Source should be done away with, and everything eventually became static again. Kind of like they were before Counter-Strike Source came out. But there was just one big difference. Now, there were a lot more props littering the levels, and so the game suffered from a new problem. because it turns out it's really annoying to have lots of stuff jutting out everywhere for you to get snagged on as you're just trying to run down a corridor. Zol has posted some great examples of this on Twitter, demonstrating how many things can interfere with your movement, or with thrown grenades, or with your bullets that you fire, as you're simply trying to get from A to B. This isn't a new problem, it's been around since the beginning, it's just that back then people didn't care quite so much to fix it. But as graphics have become more advanced, it's become more of an issue, because there's now more stuff in all of the levels for us to get snagged on as we're simply trying to get by. The worst offender is when stuff gets in the way of your shooting when it doesn't look like it should, or vice versa. Check out this pillar here, which is blocking my bullets with its hitbox despite it appearing as though it shouldn't be hitting it in this example. This is unforgivable, and luckily doesn't happen too often anymore. What's harder to fix, however, is the general issue of clutter just getting in the way of your sight and movement. Look at Banana. Here's CS 1.6's, Condition Zeros, Counter-Strike Sources, CSGO's, CSGO's Mark II. My goodness, there really are lots of versions of this map, aren't there? And finally, here is CS2's. I don't think the simplest version of the map is the clearest looking here. The textures used in 1.6 are simply too noisy, and may mask a player's outline compared with the much smoother, simpler look of Condition Zeros, which, despite being set at night, looks rather clear and readable. In my opinion, in this example at least, the visibility problems peaked in early CSGO times with this version of the map. Okay, they've added a tarpaulin into the wood stack here, which is an improvement over the previous version. But look at how these pillars obstruct sight and movement. Look at this forest intruding on the left. Compared with that, CS2's one is really clean, maybe even second cleanest behind Condition Zero's version. Now, Valve have very clearly made this most recent one in a rather paranoid state, as they jolly well should have done. You can guarantee that every time a mapper places an item down in the editor, they have to consider how it could possibly interfere with the grand finals of a tournament game in 3 years' time or so, and whether it's worth placing it down now. That's why these bits sticking out from the buildings only stick out by a tiny amount, and don't block your movement. It's why the ground is generally very smooth, albeit the occasional step, which I'm sure some people will still want to complain about. And it's why any foliage is very politely tucking itself right into the corners or well overhead in order to avoid interfering with any possible sightlines. Mapping for Counter-Strike has become an assault course for mappers, rather ironically to prevent it from becoming one for players. And no matter how I might feel about it, the game has spoken. Clutter is bad, but it's still got to be featured to make the game look pretty. But you can tell that Valve is torn. They want their maps to look like actual places full of decorative features, but at the same time they know they have to keep the clutter away from the routes around the level and to give what clutter there is clean outlines and distinct colours in order to make players stood around or behind them easily visible. But no matter what they do, the outlines of stuff will always be more complicated than they used to be, because CS2 is no longer a bunch of boxy rooms filled with boxy crates. It is now a competitive map, masquerading as a real place. What do you make of this argument? If a game is full of crates, you immediately understand a crate every time you see and interact with one. You know how bullets will pass through it, you know whether or not you can stand on it, and so on. But when the map is full of hundreds of different props, it might take your brain a fraction of a second longer to register what it is that you're looking at, and how that particular prop might interact with bullets and grenades that you may wish to bounce off those props. This is one of those arguments that sounds like it makes sense, but it's like impossible to test for sure how much truth there is to this and how much it even matters. Maybe it's nice to sometimes have different props that behave differently from one another. Maybe it is a trade-off between having the map be immediately accessible for new players versus providing veterans of that map more options and gameplay depth later on. I'm happy so long as the same prop behaves the same every time it's used, in every map that it's featured in. Earlier this year I criticised the pallets on Overpass, because each of them seemed to behave differently. Some of them blocked your movement, others let you stand on top of them, some of the benches on the map could be stood on, while others, which looked identical, wouldn't let you. And I think we can all agree that this just isn't right. And Valve soon corrected it once I pointed it out. So there, I suspect a lot more thought goes into these maps than some people give Valve credit for, but there are still some instances where they may have missed something that's immediately obvious to you as being wrong or suboptimal, so don't be afraid to point stuff like that out. And grenade bounces are even more complicated, especially when the maps have open skyboxes like we have now. There is simply no way a mapper can anticipate in advance every way in which a player will chuck a smoke across a map, from every point to every other point. And I suspect grenade clipping brushes will always be an afterthought, coming in to remedy broken spots only after they've been exploited enough to become known problem areas. Grenade bounces are something else that becomes exponentially more difficult to prepare for as maps get increasingly detailed. And this isn't an issue that only affects Counter-Strike. Zol provided me with a great example of this in Quake Live. A grenade launcher such as this would have had no problem in the older, simpler and blockier looking games. But in a newer one like this, with more stuff sticking out everywhere, it makes grenade bounces very tricky to anticipate. Valve, please fix. He also told me to check out Black Mesa, which he thinks is a bad contender for clipping as well. So I ran about it, getting blocked by stuff for a while. And I'll admit, it being single player makes it more forgiving of such issues, but still, Valve, please fix. Ready or Not's Trump wall level has this hideous room full of ankle-high walls that you can't step over, which is a genuine crime in a game that already has poor visibility and the slowest walking speed and acceleration in gaming history. And the persistent threat of solid teammates blocking your backtracking as they're forever trying to come inside you from behind. All these things combined risk slowing the already tediously slow action in this game to a total and prolonged standstill. Valve, please fix. So all things considered, Counter-Strike has been there, done that, and has been tackling these kinds of issues for literally decades already. It's just that the expectations for this game are now so incredibly high that even the very best of maps can and will be exploited by someone somewhere. You can only anticipate so much, the rest is just a case of patching it all up as it goes. So, in Counter-Strike, gameplay should come first, but it leaves plenty of leeway for the graphics as well, which can and will be used to make stuff look nicer. Having pretty looking clutter everywhere is just a fact of life we're going to have to accept, unless everybody can universally agree to return to the old boxy style of maps again. Which I can certainly say would make my life easier again. I gave up mapping once it required a whole team of people and dedicated texturers and modelers to even stand a chance of getting their map considered for inclusion in the game. The standards have simply risen beyond what a lone mapper can hope to achieve anymore. And I think that's a shame because it means that any map that does eventually become beautiful and polished enough to be included will likely avoid taking the risks involved in making something that's unique and unusual to play in some way. And we're only just getting started with CS2. You only have to see how different CSGO was at the end of its lifetime versus the beginning. And if I'm honest, I'm struggling to speculate about how CS2 will be in 5 or 10 years' time. But one thing's for sure, it's going to end up very competitive and very, very, very pretty.